before we dive into the dark, twisted, and occasionally, what the actual hell side of humanity. Here's a quick note from our imaginary legal team, which consists of a sleep-deprived parent, Google, and a stress ball named Greg. This podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes. Yes. Both. It's just me, researching these cases like your overly invested ex creeping your socials, thoroughly, obsessively, and with just a hint of judgment. The opinions here are entirely my own and do not represent law enforcement, lawyers, doctors, or your cousin Karen who thinks she's a detective because she binged 4 crime docs and made a Pinterest board. Also, everyone is innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, even if the vibes are giving that, yep, they did it. And no, I'm not a licensed psychologist or a doctor, just someone with a brain full of psychology textbooks, way too much coffee, and disturbing level of curiosity. And sometimes, there's a handsome guy who's mostly here for the snacks and the dramatic one-liners. So do your own research. I'm here for insight, empathy, and storytelling. Full disclaimers in the episode description.
Hey guys, if you're new here, welcome to my little corner of chaos. I'm Rachel, and I host Crime Unleashed with frequent appearances from my husband and other brave souls I can rope in along the way. This is what I do at night instead of sleeping, like normal people. So, you bring the snacks, your blanket, and your favorite drink, and I'll open the case file. Let's jump in.
Before we start, a content trigger warning. This episode includes graphic descriptions of violence, murder, cannibalism, sexual violence, mental health struggles, and crimes involving vulnerable individuals. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Please take care of yourself.
This guy wasn't just your run-of-the-mill killer. He literally believed he needed to drink blood to keep himself alive. His crimes were straight up horrifying, fueled by extreme delusions and paranoia. In fact, this case was analyzed by criminologists, psychologists, and criminal justice students to gain a deeper understanding of the mind of a serial killer, the role mental health plays in criminal behavior, and how society can improve its approach to these complex challenges. Killing 6 people during this 1-month period, drinking the blood of his victims, and then cannibalized their remains, he earned his nickname. And straight out of the horror movie, The Vampire Next Door. This is the horrific true story of Richard Chase. Welcome to Crime Unleashed. Okay, so Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23rd, 1950 in Sacramento, California. And no shock here, his childhood was a mess. His home life was strict and, by many accounts, abusive. It's the kind of environment that time and time again becomes the breeding ground for deeply disturbed behavior later in life. But Chase's father was described as controlling, while his mother was reportedly mentally unstable. There are claims that Richard was subjected to physical discipline, but whether it crossed the line into abuse is kind of murky, especially when viewed through the lens of that era. So back then, harsh discipline was often normalized. Children weren't seen as individuals with rights. They were actually expected to obey, period. And anything that happens after that, it's, up to the parents on their discipline. So what some saw as ordinary parenting might today be recognized as abusive. So whether it was emotional instability, mental instability, physical punishment, or all three, one thing I believe, Richard Chase was in his own world completely. Now, if his mother truly struggled with mental illness, there's the possibility of a genetic component as well. But let's not forget, back then, just about every woman who showed emotion was labeled unstable. I mean, they were sent to the loony bin quite often. Still, in Chase's case, it's likely a mix of both nature and nurture colliding in the worst possible way. Now, if you know anything about serial killer psychology, which you're on here, I'm sure you do, you know about the McDonald triad: bedwetting, animal cruelty, and setting fires. Guess what? Chase checked 2 out of 3. He was a chronic bedwetter, and he had a nasty little habit of torturing and killing animals. So, yeah, the warning signs were there. But I do need to take a little, like a deeper dive into this, because bedwetting, especially when it continues into later childhood, is almost always tied to trauma, fear, abuse. It's not just some random, embarrassing thing that kids do. Most times it's a psychological response to extreme stress. Of course, not every case of bedwetting should immediately be labeled as a sign of trauma. There are many kids who experience it for various reasons, like developmental delays or simply outgrowing, you know, it in their own time. So happening to a certain age and them just outgrowing it. But when it comes to, like a larger pattern, like in this case of Richard Chase, where you see more than just one symptom from that triad: bedwetting, animal cruelty, and fire setting, that is when we start to see the real warning signs stacking up. Chase, he didn't just kill animals, he drank their blood. That's a whole different level of psychosis. I mean, when the cruelty crosses over into blood drinking, I would say you've got a textbook example of someone whose psychological state is probably deteriorating. It's no longer just a tough kid or a bad boy problem. It's an escalating issue, a pattern of deviance that's deeply rooted in something that's much darker. So in some kids, these behaviors may be isolated incidents or developmental quirks, but when you combine them in someone like Richard Chase, who was also exhibiting violent tendencies and showing signs of psychosis as he grew older, you start to see the warning signs. They're clearly there, and they're not just a coincidence. But I had to break this down. I didn't sit through all of these psychology classes just to let this kind of go, but fire setting, this one's about like destruction, control. Kids who set fires aren't just playing with matches. Typically, they're often expressing deep anger. They're trying to feel something or subconsciously acting out their chaos. So while it wasn't explicitly part of Chase's child history, he definitely, you could see his desire for destruction and chaos play out in forms of like different forms in his later killings. Back to Chase though, he was a chronic bedwetter. But more than that, he displayed elements of all these warning signs and lived in a world entirely detached from reality. In Whoever Fights Monsters, the FBI profiler Robert Ressler describes Chase as a young man whose mind wasn't wired for stability. It was wired for survival. And that distinction made him unpredictable and dangerous. So if you ever want to read a great book, Whoever Fights Monsters is a really great book. Typically, all of these things, though, are red flags we often see in early lives of violent offenders. Here's the thing, though, and I want you to think about. What if someone had truly stepped in? What if the warning signs hadn't been brushed aside, ignored, or dismissed as, someone else's problem? Could things, or even just be dismissed as a, quote, problem child? Now, could things have turned out differently? Or was Richard Chase always destined to become the vampire of Sacramento? It's the age-old debate, are monsters born or are they made? In Chase's case, it's hard to say, but if there was ever someone who seemed born teetering on the edge, it was definitely him. All of this, it does start to tell a story. His behavior pattern is like pieces of a puzzle, and when you put them together, they tell you a lot about the potential future of this person. I'm not saying that happens to everyone. I'm just saying that this is typical with these type of patterns. Ultimately, all of it was laying the foundation for the horrors he would commit later. And unfortunately, no one was there to connect the dots, offer support, or even intervene before it was too late. He could have been, I don't know if he could have been saved. Let's say this. I feel like if there was a little bit more support and the red flags were actually seen as red flags, I think it could have gone a different way, but we won't know. And just FYI, I am not excusing his actions, nor am I blaming anyone else. I am saying that many times there are warning signs. In this case, nurture versus nature. I truly believe it was both, though. It typically isn't just one or the other. In fact, it rarely is. In this case, it is hard to say which one had more of an impact as far as nurture, nature. But again, there typically is warning signs. But back then it was different. It was a different life. So they didn't really have all the facts that we have now in this day and time. But anyway, Richard, as a teen, things got even weirder. He developed a serious drinking problem and he experimented with drugs, mainly LSD. He smoked weed, but the biggest red flag is he started becoming obsessed with his own body. He convinced himself that his heart was shrinking. Yes, shrinking. He could feel it shrinking. And at one point, he thought his stomach was backwards. So this guy he desperately needed help, but instead he kind of just spiraled deeper into his delusions. It's heartbreaking, really. I mean, here's someone who needed real help, someone who should have probably been in therapy or at least receiving psychiatric care at an early age. But the psychiatric care that he did receive was later, and I think that has a big part in not helping him. But here's the thing, back then, again, they didn't understand mental illness the way that we do now. The field of psychology was still evolving and resources were limited. So even if someone had tried to help Richard Chase, would they have even known how to help him? I mean, I don't know. But Richard went to school in Mira Loma, California, and graduated in 1968.
Richard Trenton Chase went by the name of Rick. He went to high school here, Mira Loma, where he graduated in 1968.
He was not involved in any fights. This has been told by one of the principals there. He was quiet and strange, but non-violent. They also say that he just acted strange, which they do feel had a lot to do with the drugs that he might have been on at that time. So it's kind of hard to say if he was being, strange because of his delusions or strange because he was on drugs, or both, really. Another early sign that something isn't just quite right was when he was emerging to his early teens. He became fixated on the infamous James Younger gang. If y'all haven't, they were outlaws in like the 1800s, but he began to imagine himself as one of them. Chase even went as far as cutting out photos of the gang and then pasting his own face over theirs. He tried selling these doctored images and begged his mother for a cowboy hat to complete the fantasy. She refused, but this was in his early teens, which I don't find this bad. This is what they're saying, that it was kind of like a warning sign. But if there wasn't any other warning signs, then I would definitely not count this as a red flag. But because of the other warning signs, I think that's why they felt that this kind of was out of place. At home, his behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He would sometimes strip naked in the family lounge. Then he would crank the heater to full blast and throw open the windows. So an unsettling combination of extreme that hinted at a deeper psychological issue right there. Despite this, Chase apparently presented as a clean-cut and relatively popular kid during his high school years. That was what was said in an interview. In 1965, he actually began dating a girl and seemed to function fairly well. But as he transitioned into adulthood, that's when things began to unravel. Here's his appearances, apparently grew more unkept, and his social behavior became noticeably off. According to one interview, I believe it was on the Internet Archive. It said, or that the guy that was speaking, he said people who worked with him during that time period described him as a good worker, though undeniably strange. He held jobs but had a habit of walking out mid-shift if he argued with his girlfriend. Eventually, that pattern cost him his employment, so he got fired. Later, in another unsettling account, a man who knew Chase recalled being invited over to his house. Chase was renting another house, and after moving out of his mother's home, he invited this man. I think they were co-workers. When the man arrived, he noticed there was a 13-year-old girl there, and at first he assumed Chase was helping a runaway. But he states the situation quickly fell off, like there was something darker at play, and he decided to leave. He left and didn't ask any questions. And unfortunately, I don't know anything else about that child. He just said that he left and didn't ask questions, and that was it for that interview as far as that subject. So that's kind of, for me, that's sad because I couldn't get that question answered. But this same acquaintance, though, reflected on the drastic change in Chase over time. In the beginning, he said Chase seemed awkward but normal. He had a job, he had a girlfriend, he had a life that looked relatively stable from the outside, but just a couple of years later, he was unrecognizable, physically gaunt, mentally fractured, socially distant. But apparently Chase had told him that he was on a mission, quote. That the man recalled that that's what he was told by Chase, but he couldn't explain what that meant, and it felt different. Not just drugs, something more, and he didn't actually ask any more questions about his mission. He just moved on. So I don't know. I can imagine what his mission was, but again, I don't know exactly what that mission was. But in December 1973, that internal collapse started becoming external. Chase wandered into the emergency room at American River Hospital, convinced he was suffering from all kinds of imagined ailments. He spent 2 days in the psychiatric ward. The intake report described him as filthy, disheveled, deteriorated, and foul-smelling. But instead of getting this long-term help, he was actually just discharged after his mother intervened. Staff noted her as hostile and aggressive, and they actually referred to her as, quote, so-called schizophrenic mother. So, yeah, and like I said, they did feel that she was mentally ill. So I didn't get any more about that specific time. But after his release, things briefly improved. Chase began taking medication prescribed by the hospital. He gained weight, and he was even given an oxygen tank to ease frequent panic attacks, which is great. But that stability didn't last. His mother believed that illegal drugs caused his decline. His father disagreed. Whatever the cause, Chase's grip on reality loosened further. He began talking to himself, and he accused his mother of controlling his mind, and later made the same claim about his sister Pamela. And at one point, he struggled even to sign his own name. Now, we're going to get to a part where his mom actually takes him off of medication, and I feel like this might have happened because of how she felt about medication. I feel like this could have been something that happened at that time, because it sounds like when he started changing, it would be something from not taking medication anymore, but I'm not sure. With Chase bouncing between his mother and father, like their homes now, both eventually just came to the same conclusion. They really couldn't handle him anymore, so they actually got him his own apartment again. By his early 20s in 1976 and living on his own again, Chase was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was institutionalized after being found injecting rabbit blood into his veins. Yes, really. He believed that his blood was turning to dust and that drinking blood was the only way to stay alive. And so, if that's not a terrifying glimpse into his mind, I don't know what is. He was sent to the American River Hospital Psychiatric Health Facility again, and there he complained of heart weakness, said that his body was just falling apart. He refused to participate in any group activities, and eventually he was transferred to Beverly Manor Psychiatric Hospital. That's where they started his meds again, but then sent him back out into the world. So you can probably guess how that turned out. But really quick, let's talk about the absolute disaster that was mental health system in 1970s. Because let me tell you, it really was a mess. And that, I believe that mess helped created the perfect storm for someone like Richard Chase to really just slip through the cracks and become the literal vampire of Sacramento. I mean, again, he was injecting rabbit blood in his veins. He was drinking blood, and they knew this. So by the time Chase was, spiraling out of control, the U.S. was deep into a full-blown mental health crisis. Mental institutions were actually shutting down left and right thanks to a little thing called deinstitutionalization. I think I got that right, which in theory was supposed to be a good thing. The idea was to move people out of these often brutal and overcrowded asylums and into a community-based care, which sounds great, except they forgot to create this wonderful place. The community-based care was actually never built. So that meant thousands of people who needed serious psychiatric help were just kind of dumped into the streets or back into homes that really weren't equipped to handle them. And Chase was textbook for someone who shouldn't ever be left on his own devices. I don't know. That being said, psychiatric institutions back then weren't always the safest or most effective places either. Many were, underfunded, overcrowded, and unfortunately some were plagued by neglect and abuse. Over time, public outcry and investigative reports exposed these conditions, which led to many of them being shut down or reformed during that deinstitutionalization movement. Many hospitals in the U.S., especially from the 1950s to the 1970s, were exposed for poor treatment, abuse, and inhumane conditions. Of course, not all of these were shut down because of abuse, but a lot of them were. Some, though, were closed for, funding cuts, policy shifts, and maybe even the push toward community-based care. But either way, in the 70s, there might not have been a lot of help for him. However, with all that Chase was doing and had done, I think it's safe to say that maybe this guy shouldn't have been out here on his own. But no, he was actually deemed, quote, not a danger to himself or others, and he was let out. Even though the staff at the hospital literally nicknamed him Dracula because of his obsession with blood. You can't make this up, seriously.
We learned that Rick Chase was leaving Beverly Manor. You tried to stop this, but what did you do? How did you try to stop it?
Well, I voiced my objections to the director of nurses that I didn't feel totally good. There was the staff that Richard was safe to be returned to society. And she didn't seem too sympathetic to that. So then I voiced my objections to everyone in hospital administration, the administrative program director, the doctor. And then I called the county conservator's office. And
no one wanted to help them.
No.
Nothing they could do.
No. It was just there were others who were in control of the situation who allowed this to happen. They were forewarned, not just by myself, but by many people in the hospital, that this guy was dangerous and shouldn't be released because he was sick.
Chase was left to roam free. His mother weaned him off, as I mentioned before, she weaned him off his meds this time. Again, I don't know if she did last time, but it could have happened. because it made him like a zombie, is what she said. And within a couple years, he escalated from killing animals to eventually just brutally murdering human beings. During a later investigation, a disturbing incident from August 1977 came to light. Richard Chase had been stopped and arrested on a reservation near Pyramid Lake, Nevada. He was completely naked, his body smeared in blood. Inside his truck, officers discovered a bucket, and inside that bucket was a liver. Fearing they had just stumbled upon a homicide, police immediately launched an investigation. Witnesses claim, though, at that time Chase had been seen earlier with a dog, but the animal was never found. When questioned, Chase told officers the blood was coming from his own body. As for the dog, again, he claimed he didn't know what happened to it. In the end, the blood turned out to be from a cow. No charges were filed, and Chase was let go again. He walked free. But that moment was another warning sign. One, the system didn't heed. And the cost of that failure was staggering. Innocent lives taken in ways almost too horrific to really comprehend. Now, I've got to say, prescriptions are a tough topic. People feel strongly about them, and for good reason. And I do too. In Richard Chase's case, though, once he stopped taking his medications, things went from erratic to completely unhinged. Now, let's be real, sometimes these medications can cause problems of their own. There are side effects while you're on them, and often even worse, side effects when you stop. That's no secret. Unfortunately, we'll never really know how much that played into his actions, but we do know that him ditching his medications did not help. If anything, it sped up his descent into something much darker. In Chase's case, there was more going on. A dangerous combination of internal struggles and external chaos that ultimately pushed him over the edge. Again, not using it as an excuse for his actions later in life, because once you hit a certain age, people usually know right from wrong. But here's the thing, based on the book, again, Whoever Fights Monsters by Ressler noted that Chase had no real understanding of right or wrong in the traditional sense. He wasn't killing out of anger or thrill-seeking like some serial killers. He was operating entirely within a world of his own twisted logic, where those horrific acts made sense to him. In this case, he needed to be kept in a safe place for him and for others. Okay, so the next part is absolutely insane, and honestly a giant neon red flag warning just flashing above the guy's head. So Chase started breaking into houses. He didn't exactly have a type when it came to his victims. His attacks were just more about opportunity than anything. Whoever was around and accessible during one of his psychotic episodes. But he wasn't breaking into these houses to steal anything. No. That would make too much sense. Instead, he was actually testing the doors. So, in his deranged logic, if a door was unlocked, that meant he was invited in. If it was locked, then the universe or whatever was telling him he wasn't welcome. So can we just pause for a second? Like, what? That's straight up vampire logic. You remember that movie, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, one of my favorite movies? Well, in that movie, they had to be invited in. Just to get into the house, they had to be invited in, or they couldn't come in. Sorry. Love that movie, but yeah. So that's how Chase was thinking. He truly believed that he was some kind of supernatural being on a mission, on a hunt. And when you think about it, that kind of belief system feels what? It feels childlike. Not in innocence, but in logic. A twisted, distorted version of a child's reasoning. So primitive, fantastical, and dangerously detached from reality. The mindset that mindset may have played a lot or a huge role in shaping who he became. Personally, I find the mind a fascinating thing, the psychological side of it. And if you do too, and you're curious about his psyche, that book, Whoever Fights Monsters by that FBI profiler, Robert Ressler, he wrote about the interviews that he had with Chase. It's one of the few in-depth looks into Chase's fractured mind. So trust me, it's a great book. It's just as terrifying as it is compelling. So if you want to, read anything about that, that's a great book to read. Sadly, though, it didn't stop there. He escalated. Now, trigger warning for, the next parts of, pretty much all of it. In the period before his murders, Richard Chase was increasingly in the grip of his delusions. He had been going back and forth again, living with his mom on it, and then living on his own. And at some point, when he was living with his mom, he moved out again when he developed the idea that she was poisoning him. This is where Richard Chase began his rampage. I'm going to walk you through the victims, not just to recount a story, but because it's important that we remember them. Their names deserve to live on. So, first victim was Ambrose Griffin, December 29th, 1977. Chase took his first life just days before the new year. And again, it was 1977 in December, and Ambrose Griffin was a 50-year-old engineer. He was a father of two, and he was helping his wife unload the groceries when, out of nowhere, he was shot in his driveway. And just like that, no warning, no robbery, just a random, senseless killing. This was Chase's first taste of blood, and unfortunately, it was not his last. The next one was January 23rd, so not even a month. This was when his thirst for blood took a full swing. He didn't want to just kill, he wanted to consume. So again, not even a month since his last kill. On January 23rd, sometime between 9:30 a.m. and 12:30 p.m., he broke into the home of Teresa Wallen, a 20-year-old who was 3 months pregnant. And honestly, what he did was pure nightmare. He did shoot her 3 times. Then in his delusional frenzy, he mutilated her body with her own butcher knife. He bathed in her blood and drank it, and smeared her organs across the wall like a grotesque message only he could understand. She was discovered by her husband, David Wallen, when he came home around 6 p.m. Wallen had been, again, 3 months pregnant with a boy that they had both decided to name Dane. I cannot imagine walking into something like that. David later told The Sun, quote, "I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what I'd just seen or what had just happened. It was like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from." This was the scene that was left behind Richard Chase, who would later admit to approaching a pregnant woman as she stepped outside to take out the trash. So incredibly sad and disturbing. The next one was actually 4 days later. Chase went all in. Now, this happened on January 27th, 1978, and there are multiple victims. So sometime after 10:25 a.m., so in broad daylight, he stormed into the home of Evelyn Marath. She was 38. She had a son named Jason, who was 6 years old, and they were both shot in the head while they were trying to run. Evelyn's 22-month-old nephew, David, was decapitated and mutilated, and a family friend, Dan Meredith, he was a 51-year-old guy. He was shot in the head as well. In haste, Chase actually left bloody footprints all over the house. He also took the station wagon, which was actually found a few blocks from the murder scene, and the engine was still running. But Evelyn Marath and her friend were both killed by gunshots to the head. It was quick, but what followed was deeply disturbing. Evelyn's body was found in her bedroom, disemboweled, and subjected to acts of necrophilia, echoing the horror of Chase's earlier crime. Her 6-year-old son, Jason, had also been shot multiple times in the head. Now, his body had not been mutilated, but the violence he experienced was no less devastating. The youngest victim, 22-month-old David, was missing from the scene. His disappearance triggered a widespread search across Sacramento. Tragically, the search ended days later when his body was found inside a cardboard box in a vacant lot. He had been, as I mentioned, decapitated.
The condition was such that it was thoroughly litigated before the jury. it is a mitigating factor, but I didn't think it outweighed the aggravating factors. And in my mind alone, the murder of a 22-month-old baby in which the defendant decapitated the child, and the circumstances surrounding that murder itself is sufficient to impose the death penalty, aside from the other 5 persons that he killed.
These are the kind of details that leaves a permanent mark on everyone who learns about it. So by now, Sacramento was in a full-blown panic mode. This wasn't just a serial killer. Like, they were looking for a monster. But he had left a ton of evidence behind, and so when the police connected the murders, they easily closed in. Following the tragic murders of the Marath family, a family friend, he was in law enforcement, he actually launched an intensive manhunt for that suspect. Witnesses had described seeing a man wearing an orange parka near the crime scene. Nancy Holden, she went to school with Richard Chase, had actually encountered him at the Sacramento shopping center shortly after the murders. She was taken back by his appearance and his erratic behavior, but also their brief conversation. Chase made an unsettling remark when they were talking. He asked, quote, "Were you on the motorcycle when Kurt was killed?" referencing Nancy's boyfriend who had died in a motorcycle accident. This bizarre question, coupled with the unkept state and the how he looked, how he smelled, the fact that he was wearing an orange parka matching the suspect's description, raised alarms for her. So, trusting her instincts, she promptly reported the encounter to authorities. And then, of course, acting on Holden's tip, they proceeded to look for Chase and his residence. Now, when they arrived, they found evidence that firmly linked him directly to these homicides. Among the items recovered was the .22 caliber handgun registered to Chase in his name, and it was identified as the weapon used in the killings. And additionally, authorities discovered bloodstained clothing and other incriminating items that painted a grim picture of his involvement. When they were actually able to track him down to that apartment, they found him there as well, covered in blood. Inside his fridge were buckets of blended organs, and he was drinking them. They found David, the 22-month-old. His brain was in a container and some of his body parts in a plastic wrap. In addition, there were parts of Evelyn Marath and Teresa Wallen in his refrigerator, and there were several pet collars discarded on the counter. His entire place was straight up out of a horror movie. Blood-soaked walls, animal parts in the sink, human remains whirling around in a blender. And according to some reports, he had evidence of plans to carry out more than 40 more killings they found in his apartment. Chase was taken into custody without incident. The physical evidence during this investigation provided a compelling case against him, leading obviously to his eventual conviction. The swift action by the law enforcement and the citizens like Nancy Holden brought an end to Chase's reign of terror and ensured that he could no longer harm others. Now, Richard Chase's trial began January 2nd, 1979. Now, this is a year almost to the date of his victims. And it lasted for 5 months. During this time, various testimonies were presented, including Chase's own testimony in late March, where he spoke for 3 hours about his treatment by other prisoners. His defense tried to plead insanity, which makes sense, but the jury was not having any of it. The guy was mentally ill, and I truly believe that, but he was a danger to everyone. The prosecution emphasized that Chase had a choice in his actions, which was a key point in arguing against the insanity defense. So at the end, the verdict was guilty on all 6 counts of murder. And in May of 1979, they rejected the insanity defense, and they realized and recognized the gravity of his claims, and the sentence was death by gas chamber. Chase's time in prison, though, was a grim reflection of his brokenness he carried inside. He was transferred to the San Quentin State Prison, where he was isolated from other inmates, not just because of the horrific nature of his crimes, but because his mental health struggles that controlled his life, and because other inmates apparently feared him due to his violent offenses. They often encouraged him to kill himself. His suicide attempts while in prison were just cries for help. They were the tragedy of what his life was, and what, the fact that he never really had a chance. It seems, while his crimes are unforgivable, it's hard to ignore that he never really had the proper support. For me, this is my own opinion. And so he had no choice. He was going to spiral out of control with the mind that he had. But Chase never made it to the gas chamber. On December 26, 1980, he was found dead in his prison cell, and the cause of death was suicide by overdose. He stockpiled his antidepressants and took them all at once. This case is one of the most disturbing in history, not just because of violence, but because Chase was a walking red flag. There were so many warning signs, yet time and time again, he slipped through the cracks. But that is really a lot of crime stories that we do hear about. There's signs. There's things that get missed, and they slip through the cracks. The crime scenes left by Richard were profoundly disturbing, leaving just a mark on the detectives and the forensic experts who encountered them. So while specific firsthand accounts for the detectives are kind of scarce, available sources and that kind of stuff, most of them, if everything that I found, provide insight into the horrors that they face, but it was hard to find just like the firsthand accounts. But the book does have that firsthand account by the FBI agent, Robert Ressler. So again, he interviewed Chase, and he just recounted the chilling nature of his crimes. What he said, Robert recounts his experience interviewing some of the most notorious serial killers, and Richard Chase was one of those. He describes kind of like Chase deeply paranoid, delusional, completely disconnected from reality. So, like I said previously, he wasn't just mentally ill, he was severely psychotic. Chase believed that his blood was turning into powder. People were stilling his pulmonary arteries. I mean, he was more than just, mentally ill. I mean, the murder wasn't evil, it was survival for him. And that's in his own head. So everything like this, all of that is highlighted in that book. So if you really want to read about it, go grab it. It's awesome. And when I say awesome, I mean, it's a very in-depth look at what they saw in Richard. So what struck Ressler most, though, was how passive Chase was during the interviews. He was soft-spoken, cooperative, really just childlike. He wasn't a monster with rage in his eyes. He was a man consumed by psychosis. And for Ressler, that's what made him even more dangerous. Because Richard Chase wasn't trying to hide what he was. He didn't think that he needed to hide. He was being him, and there wasn't a problem with that in his mind. So there's also the documentary series World's Most Evil Killers in 2020. It features it's on 2020. It features the episode on Richard Chase called Richard Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. This included interviews with individuals involved in the case. So one of them being Frank Davidson. He was the former crime scene investigator. He appears in this episode, providing professional insights into the investigation and the impact the crime scene had on many, many who worked it. Now, again, while direct quotes from the detectives at the crime scene are limited and, public records, these sources collectively underscore the profound psychological toll that Chase's heinous acts had on law enforcement personnel tasked with investigating them. All right, guys, so quick questions. Would he have still become a monster if he got the right help? Or do you think he was always destined to be a monster? I would love to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments because I need to know what you think about this one. And we will be back next week with another dark chapter, so stay tuned. We've got plenty more bizarre and terrifying cases to cover. Bye.